My boss told me to let this patient die or face a massive criminal charge that would ruin my life forever. I chose to save him, unaware that I was operating on the only witness who could expose a deadly, organized scheme. The clock on the wall of the emergency room didn't just tick, it hammered. Every rhythmic thud felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of my career. I've spent 15 years in this hospital, climbing from a terrified intern to the lead trauma surgeon. I lived for the adrenaline, the smell of antiseptic, and the silent, heavy weight of a life hanging in the balance. But today, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just the usual chaos of a Friday night. It was a cold, suffocating tension that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with politics. The hospital doors burst open, and a gurney was rushed in, surrounded by a swarm of paramedics and 2 men in dark, nondescript suits. The patient was a young man, barely 20, his face obscured by a mask of blood and road grime. His vitals were crashing. I didn't need a monitor to tell me he was minutes away from flatlining. His breathing was labored, a wet, rattling sound that signaled a collapsed lung and internal hemorrhaging. "Trauma room 1, now," I barked, already snapping on my gloves. "Stop!" The voice was cold, sharp, and came from behind me. It was Dr. Sterling, the chief of surgery, and a man who valued the hospital's endowment more than its Hippocratic oath. He was flanked by the hospital's legal counsel. "Step away from that patient, Leo," Sterling said, his eyes narrowed. "He's not to be treated here." I froze, my hand hovering over the patient's chest. "He's dying, Marcus. He has maybe 10 minutes. We have the facilities. We have the blood." "He is a person of interest in a massive internal investigation," Sterling interrupted, his voice lowering but losing none of its edge. "He's been linked to an organized scheme, a network of radicals involved in an attempt to break lives with serious criminal charges. The Service of Internal Security has specifically requested that he be transported to a secure facility. They don't want him touched by civilian doctors." "A secure facility is 40 minutes away in this weather," I yelled, gesturing to the torrential rain lashing against the windows. "He won't make it to the parking lot, let alone another hospital. This is a medical facility, not a holding cell. If he dies because we sat on our hands, that's on us." "It's on the protocol, Leo," Sterling countered, stepping closer. "If you touch him, you are interfering with a high-level investigation. You'll be viewed as an accomplice to whatever organized scheme he's part of. Look at the marks on him. Those aren't accidents. This kid is dangerous, or he knows people who are. If you move that scalpel, you are signing your own dismissal. I will personally see to it that your license is revoked before the sun comes up." I looked down at the boy. His hand, trembling and pale, reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my white coat. His eyes were wide, filled with a primal, suffocating terror. He wasn't a radical or a criminal to me in that moment. He was a human being whose heart was struggling to beat. I saw the fear of a child, not the cold gaze of someone involved in an organized scheme. "I'm a doctor, Marcus," I whispered, "not a judge." I pushed the gurney toward the operating theater. The paramedics looked at Sterling, then at me. They chose me. We burst through the double doors, leaving the chief of surgery screaming threats in the hallway. The surgery was a nightmare. Every time I tried to stop the bleeding, another vessel blew. He had multiple fragments lodged near his spine, wounds that looked suspiciously like they came from illegal weapons, though I didn't let my mind dwell on that. We worked for 4 hours. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. I knew that every stitch I sewed was another nail in my professional coffin. I was breaking every protocol in the book, defying the internal check orders, and ignoring a direct command from my superior. By 4 a.m., we had stabilized him. He was alive. Barely, but alive. I stepped out of the OR, my scrubs soaked in sweat and blood. I didn't even get to the sink to wash my hands before Sterling was there. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was calm, which was worse. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand. "You were warned, Leo," he said, sliding the paper onto the nurse's station. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Your access to the hospital database is revoked. Security will escort you to your locker to collect your personal belongings. Don't bother calling the board. I've already briefed them. You're not a hero, you're a liability." I looked at the paper. It was my dismissal, already signed and stamped. My career, my reputation, my life's work, gone in a single night. I felt a strange sense of peace, though. I had saved the kid. I went to the locker room, my movements robotic. I took my stethoscope, a few photos, and my coat. As I walked toward the main exit, the heavy silence of the early morning was shattered. Black SUVs screeched to a halt at the ambulance bay. Men in tactical gear, far more imposing than the ones from earlier, flooded the lobby. These weren't just hospital security or local police. These were the heavy hitters from the Internal Security Service. Sterling was there, puffing out his chest, ready to hand over the criminal I had saved. He pointed toward the ICU where the boy was recovering. "He's in there." I tried to stop the surgery, but one of our doctors went rogue. "He's being dealt with." The lead officer, a man with a face like granite, didn't look at the ICU. He looked at a tablet in his hand, then up at the lobby. His eyes landed on me, standing by the exit with my box of belongings. "Dr. Leo Vance?" the officer called out. Sterling smirked. "That's him. Arrest him for whatever you need. He interfered with your investigation." The officer ignored Sterling entirely. He walked straight toward me, his heavy boots echoing on the linoleum. He stopped inches away, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the other officers fanned out, but they didn't head for the ICU. They blocked every exit, and one of them stepped behind Dr. Sterling, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dr. Vance," the lead officer said, his voice dropping to a low, respectful tone. "We've been looking for that boy for 3 days. You have no idea whose life you just saved or what you've just uncovered, but you need to put that box down." "I don't work here anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "I've been dismissed." The officer glanced at the paper in my hand, then at Sterling, who was now looking visibly pale. The officer took the dismissal paper from my hand, slowly tore it into 4 pieces, and let them fall to the floor. "Change of plans," the officer said. "The boy isn't the criminal. And as of 60 seconds ago, this hospital is under federal jurisdiction. Dr. Vance, I need you to come with me. There's something in that boy's x-rays that wasn't supposed to be there, and it's the reason they wanted him dead." Sterling stood frozen, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. The arrogance that had defined him for a decade withered under the cold gaze of the lead officer. He tried to speak, to regain some semblance of authority, but the officer, Agent Miller, as his badge indicated, simply walked past him, gesturing for me to follow. "Dr. Vance, the x-rays," Miller repeated, his voice urgent. "Show me exactly where you found the anomalies." I dropped my box of belongings. I didn't care about my termination anymore. The atmosphere in the hospital had shifted from a workplace to a combat zone. We hurried to the radiology lab, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I pulled up the digital scans of the boy's chest, my eyes widened. During the heat of the surgery, I had been so focused on stopping the massive internal bleeding and repairing the shredded lung that I had dismissed a small, shadowed object near the pleural cavity as a piece of shrapnel from whatever trauma he'd endured. "There," I said, pointing to a small cylindrical object lodged just inches from the aorta. I thought it was a fragment of debris, but looking at it now, the shape is too perfect. It's not metal, it's some kind of high-density polymer. Miller leaned in, his face hardening. "It's a data drive, a biological storage unit. That boy wasn't just a victim of an organized scheme, he was the courier who was supposed to expose it. The radicals who were tracking him didn't want him dead immediately. They wanted what was inside him. But when they realized he was heading for the service of internal security, they tried to eliminate the evidence." "By killing him?" I whispered. "By making sure he never left an operating table," Miller replied. He turned to one of his men. Lock down this floor. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. That includes medical staff." "Wait," I said, a cold realization dawning on me. If Sterling wanted him dead, if he was trying to prevent the surgery. "Sterling isn't just a bureaucrat, Leo," Miller said, looking me dead in the eye. "He's been on the payroll of this network for years. The internal check we were running wasn't just on the boy. It was on this entire hospital. This facility has been used as a hub for moving prohibited substances and laundering the proceeds of a massive organized scheme. The boy in that bed was their star witness. He turned on them, stole the encryption keys, and had them surgically implanted so they couldn't be found during a standard search." Suddenly, the lights in the radiology lab flickered and died. The hum of the hospital's ventilation system cut out, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. The emergency red lights kicked in a moment later, casting long, bloody shadows across the walls. "The power's been cut," Miller hissed, drawing his weapon. "They're already here." "Who?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The people Sterling was trying to protect," Miller said. "They can't afford for that boy to wake up, and they can't afford for you to take that drive out of him." My mind raced to the ICU. The boy was vulnerable, sedated, and hooked up to machines that required power. If the backup generators didn't kick in, he would be dead in minutes. I didn't wait for Miller's command. I sprinted out of the lab and down the darkened hallway, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. The hospital was transformed. The screams of confused patients and the frantic shouts of nurses filled the air. I reached the ICU doors and threw them open. The nurse who had been monitoring the boy was slumped over the desk, unconscious. Standing over the boy's bed was a figure in a surgical gown, their face obscured by a mask. In their hand was a syringe filled with a dark, murky liquid, a prohibited substance that would stop a heart in seconds and leave no trace in a standard toxicology report. "Stop!" I screamed. The figure turned slowly. Even with the mask, I recognized the eyes. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some hitman sent from the outside. It was Dr. Sarah Jennings, my own senior resident, the person I had mentored for 5 years, the person I trusted more than anyone in this building. She didn't look afraid. She looked disappointed. "You should have just taken the dismissal and walked away, Leo," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You always had to be the hero. But heroes don't survive in this world. They just become martyrs." She moved the needle toward the boy's IV line. I lunged at her, tackling her just as the needle pierced the plastic tubing. We crashed to the floor, the syringe skittering across the tile. Before I could regain my footing, the ICU doors burst open again. I expected Miller and his team, but instead it was Sterling, and he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 3 men in security uniforms I didn't recognize. They weren't hospital security. They were armed with illegal weapons, and their faces were cold and professional. Sterling looked down at me, a twisted, triumphant smile on his face. He wasn't the coward I thought he was. He was the conductor of this entire nightmare. "Dr. Vance," Sterling said, stepping over the broken syringe, "you've made this so much more difficult than it needed to be. Sarah, get the drive. Kill the boy. And as for Leo..." Sterling leaned down, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "I think it's time we see how well a trauma surgeon handles his own internal bleeding." One of the men stepped forward, raising the butt of his weapon to strike me. But just as he swung, the boy on the bed, the one who should have been deeply sedated, let out a gasping, jagged breath, and his hand shot out, grabbing Sterling's tie with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. The boy's eyes snapped open, but they weren't the eyes of a terrified victim anymore. They were focused, sharp, and filled with a cold, calculating rage. He pulled Sterling's face inches from his own and whispered something that made the chief of surgery's blood run cold. "You forgot one thing, Marcus," the boy rasped, his voice vibrating with a strange electronic distortion. "I wasn't the courier. I was the trap." In that moment, a high-pitched, deafening pulse erupted from the boy's chest, the very spot where the data drive was located, and every electronic device in the room, including the weapons held by the security team, began to hiss and spark with a blinding white light. The blinding white light didn't just illuminate the room, it seemed to vibrate through the very air, a high-frequency pulse that sent the mercenaries staggering back, clutching their ears. Their high-tech illegal weapons, reliant on electronic firing pins and integrated sights, hissed and sparked, rendering them nothing more than heavy clubs. Sterling screamed, more out of confusion and fear than pain, as the sheer force of the electronic discharge knocked him onto his knees. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a heavy metal tray of surgical instruments and swung it with every ounce of frustration and adrenaline I had left. It connected with the side of the nearest mercenary's head, sending him sprawling. Beside me, Sarah was still reeling from the pulse, her eyes wide and unfocused. I grabbed her arm, spinning her away from the boy's IV line, and shoved her toward the wall. "It's over, Sarah!" I yelled over the fading hum of the pulse. The ICU doors were kicked open with a thunderous crash. Agent Miller and his team flooded the room, their flashlights cutting through the haze. Unlike the mercenaries, Miller's team were using standard-issue mechanical sidearms, unaffected by the pulse. Within seconds, Sterling's men were on the floor, pinned under the weight of the internal security officers. Miller stepped into the center of the room, his weapon trained directly on Sterling. "Marcus Sterling, you are under arrest for heading an organized scheme, conspiracy to commit a felony, and the unauthorized distribution of prohibited substances. You're looking at decades in a cell, Marcus. I'd suggest you keep your mouth shut until we get to the interrogation room." Sterling looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. The mask of the powerful chief of surgery had completely disintegrated, leaving behind a pathetic broken man who had gambled his soul for a seat at a table of radicals. I was pressured. "They threatened me," he stammered, but Miller just signaled his men to haul him away. I turned back to the boy on the bed. He was pale, but his breathing was leveling out. The device in his chest had stopped glowing, the pulse having exhausted its primary energy cell. He looked at me, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. You really didn't know, did you, Doc?" he whispered. "Know what?" I asked, checking his vitals. "I'm not a courier," he said, his voice regaining its natural strength. "My name is Agent Julian Vane. I'm with the Service of Internal Security. We've been tracking Sterling's network for 18 months. The device in my chest, it's a black box recorder. It's been capturing every conversation, every transaction, every illegal order Sterling gave within these walls. We needed him to believe I was a dying witness so he would expose himself. We needed him to try and finish the job." I sat back on a stool, the weight of the night finally crashing down on me. "You risked your life. You almost died on my table just to catch him?" "We knew you were the best, Dr. Vance," Julian said, his eyes softening. "Miller's team had a file on you. They knew you'd break the rules to save a life. You were the only variable we could trust. If anyone else had been in that OR tonight, I wouldn't have made it off the table." 2 weeks later, the hospital was under new management. The organized scheme that had used the facility as a front had been dismantled, leading to dozens of arrests across the city. Sarah Jennings and Marcus Sterling were facing a huge prison sentence, their names dragged through every news outlet in the country. I was standing in my old office looking at the box of belongings I had packed on the night of my dismissal. A knock at the door startled me. It was Agent Miller, looking significantly more relaxed in a suit than he did in tactical gear. "The board of directors had a very long meeting this morning, Leo," Miller said, leaning against the doorframe. "They realized that without you, this entire hospital would have been shut down permanently. They've officially rescinded your dismissal. Not only that, but they've also offered you Sterling's old position. They want you as the new chief of surgery." I looked out the window at the city below. The trauma of that night would stay with me, but so would the memory of the choice I made. I had signed my own dismissal to save a life, and in doing so, I had saved the very institution I loved. "I'll take the job," I said, turning to Miller with a smirk, "but under one condition." "What's that?" "We're rewriting the protocol manual. From now on, the only rule in this hospital is that the patient comes first. No politics, no schemes, and definitely no more secure facilities when someone is bleeding out on my floor." Miller chuckled and extended a hand. "I think we can live with that, Doc." As he left, I picked up my stethoscope and draped it around my neck. I had been fired, hunted, and nearly killed. But as I walked back toward the emergency room, I realized I hadn't just saved my career. I had finally found the doctor I was always meant to be.